You're listening to the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast, bringing you compelling true crime stories from the Appalachian Mountains and beyond. I'm your host, Alfred Dockery. Grab your hat and a lantern, and let's get on the trail. Today I'm delighted to talk with Dr. Kevin Young, author of The Violent World of Broadus Miller, a story of murder, lynching, mobs, and judicial punishment in the Carolinas. We'll be talking about Broadus Miller and the ballads of Gladys Kincaid. Dr. Young, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Young. I'm a native of Western North Carolina, which is one of the reasons that this story of Broadus Miller really interested me. Because when I first found out about it, I was middle-aged and I'd never heard of it before. I thought that it was remarkable that I could have grown up here and had an interest in local history and Western North Carolina history, and that I'd never heard of the case. A doctorate in history from the University of Georgia, where my advisor was John Ensko, who was a very noted Appalachian historian. So I had the pleasure of working with him. And for my dissertation, I had decided to research the story of Broadus Miller and Gladys Kincaid in greater depth. I had originally started researching it as a master's student, and as a master's student, I was in an English program. So I actually got a master's in English, and I was looking at the ballads and that aspect of it. But I was so intrigued by the case that I decided to segue into history and get a doctorate in history so I could use that opportunity to research and write a dissertation on it. That eventually became the book that was published by the University of North Carolina last year.
Yeah, I hadn't heard the story either until I started work a couple of years ago with my friend Scott Lunsford on a book called Blood on the Blue Ridge. We had a chapter that started with the Will Harris shooting spree in 1906 and walked through Preston Dealey, Alvin Mansell, and then into Broadus Miller and the manhunt. So for our listeners who aren't that familiar with the case, tell them a little bit about Broadus Miller and how he came to be in the largest manhunt in Western North Carolina.
Yes, it began on the first day of summer in 1927 when a 15-year-old girl named Gladys Kincaid, who was an employee at a textile mill in Morganton, North Carolina. She was walking home from work late that afternoon, but she never arrived home. Her family began searching for her, and they found her body where she had been attacked and tossed into the woods next to the road. And so it started an immense manhunt immediately. And suspicion immediately focused on this man named Broadus Miller, who was an African-American who had only recently arrived in Morganton, who was an itinerant laborer who had come from elsewhere and had been in Morganton for just a few weeks. But he had been seen in the vicinity, and when police went to the boarding house where he had been residing, he was gone, but some of his clothing was missing. And they also discovered in the boarding house, they found a raincoat that he had been wearing, and it had been spattered with blood, apparently from where he had attacked Kincaid. And this generated just chaos in Morganton that evening. The entire town was up in arms. Everyone was infuriated about this young girl being attacked and mortally wounded. And for the next 11 days, Broadus Miller was pursued. Bloodhounds were brought in, put on his trail, and he was eventually tracked into the mountains at the foothills of Grandfather Mountain, going through Linville Gorge into some very mountainous, remote, rugged terrain. And so he became the focus of this manhunt for 11 days. And at the end of 11 days, posse eventually cornered him in the mountains, and he was gunned down under disputed circumstances. And his body was transported back to Morganton, North Carolina on a Sunday afternoon and displayed on the town square in Morganton. where it attracted an audience of thousands of people. People came from all over Burke County, where Morganton is located, and from the adjacent counties as well. So throughout the day, thousands of people streamed into Morganton to look at the corpse of Broadus Miller being displayed on the courthouse lawn.
Now,
Um,
Miller was originally from Greenwood, South Carolina, and this wasn't his first brush with the law. How did we get from Greenwood, South Carolina to Asheville to Morganton?
and that is what really intrigued me because when I first started researching the case, when I looked at the newspaper accounts of what had happened in the summer of 1927, really wasn't anything about Broadus Miller's past. I mean, he was just a guy who had mysteriously he had shown up in Morganton from who knows where, who knows why, and actually no one really cared because it was a question of if he committed this act, then it's ultimately irrelevant what he did in the past and why he's here. Let's just get him and punish him. That was the story that really intrigued me and led me into the doctoral dissertation and let me see how well I can research and dig up where this guy came from, how he happened to end up in Morganton. And what I discovered is that he had grown up as an orphan in Greenwood County, South Carolina. His parents never show up on the census records. There's no record of what actually happened to them. But he and his siblings were living in the household with an aunt and uncle who were sharecroppers in South Carolina. And he had grown up there. And then at age 17 in 1921, when agricultural depression had hit really hard in South Carolina, there was a collapse of the cotton market in 1921. And so you had all these farm workers who were unemployed, including Broadus Miller. And Broadus Miller, in his case, he had gone from Greenwood County, he had traveled to Anderson uh, to try to find work. He was 17 years old. But just a few weeks after he arrived in Anderson, South Carolina, he was arrested and charged with murdering a middle aged black woman who was the owner and manager of a boarding house in downtown Anderson, South Carolina. And it was there, I went to Anderson and I actually went to the Anderson County Courthouse and tried to find records of this case. And it was there that I really discovered something that just stunned me, which was a court order from the presiding judge in this case asking for a court-appointed psychiatrist to examine Broadus Miller because there was a serious question of his sanity, that he had severe mental problems. And the court-appointed psychiatrist, a woman doctor named Anne Young, who would then go on to become a well-known obstetrician in upstate South Carolina and delivered thousands of babies in upstate South Carolina. But she had started her career as a court-appointed psychiatrist, and she had psychiatric training, but she determined that Broadus Miller was mentally ill. And because of those circumstances, Broadus Miller was found guilty of murder, but he pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 3 years in the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia. So
Yeah,
after serving 3 years,
yeah, that's one of the things that blew my mind about this story is that there was a woman psychiatrist practicing in the court system in South Carolina in 1921.
I found that really amazing as well. She was the only certified female psychiatrist in South Carolina at the time. And she had regularly appeared in court cases in upstate South Carolina. No, so I think it was clear she was like very competent. She was very knowledgeable in the subject, but she had come to this determination about Broadus Miller.
Miller moves on from South Carolina and winds up in Asheville. And as the title of your book states, the atmosphere around him is pretty pertinent to his story. And so in Asheville, there were several cases, including Alvin Mansell and Preston Neely, which in a way I feel like set the stage for a lot of what was going on in that day and time. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, and I agree. They set the stage. They exemplify what is going on in the South during that time period in the 1920s. The cases of Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely, um, they occurred in 1925. And this is the year after Broadus Miller had been released from the penitentiary in South Carolina. And to backtrack just a bit, the reason that Miller had gone from South Carolina to Asheville to begin with was because of the impact of the boll weevil in South Carolina. Because when Miller was imprisoned, the boll weevil hit and it devastated the economy in South Carolina. And it led to this mass exodus of African Americans from South Carolina, including Miller's relatives from Greenwood, South Carolina, who had moved from Greenwood to Asheville. And what really struck me is how his life, especially during this time period, it exemplified this larger pattern, this mass migration. Because these two other individuals, Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely, they were also black South Carolinians from upstate South Carolina who had moved from upstate South Carolina to Asheville, North Carolina in the early 1920s because of the impact of the boll weevil and this mass migration. But in Asheville in 1925, there was, I think it's fair to say, it was a hysteria that was not generated in facts. There were these accusations about rape, and it became almost like the Salem witch trials in terms of the mass hysteria and looking for people to accuse and who would be labeled perpetrators. And eventually, um, because of this, Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely were both arrested, and they were both charged with the rape of white women in Asheville. Although the sole evidence, was the testimony of the accusers, which in many cases it blatantly contradicted earlier statements they had made. Um, that was the entire evidence brought against Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely, both of whom had strong alibis, both of whom had white witnesses who were willing to testify in their defense and say, look, these people were at work at the time these crimes were committed. But nonetheless, Alvin Mansell was convicted of rape. And in some ways, it surprised me even more. Preston Ely was acquitted.
Yes.
And it seemed like almost it was a balancing. It was like, okay, we've got to find somebody guilty, but we're not going to do the whole convict everybody. So it was a compromise. We'll convict one out of two, and it will send a message.
Yeah, it
And
fascinated me that they, as soon as they got done with Neely's trial, they speed ran him to the South Carolina border and dropped him off.
it's very dramatic, that entire trial, because when they were accused, when Mansell was accused first. And when he was accused, he was jailed in Asheville that evening, and a mob started forming on the streets of Asheville. And the sheriff, the Buncombe County sheriff, actually took Mansell and secretly transported him out of town. But the mob didn't know this. And so the mob had attacked Buncombe County Jail and had ransacked it, looking for Alvin Mansell, wanting to lynch him. It's the whole story of Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely. I find it very dramatic.
It seems like, if I remember correctly, they brought in some National Guard troops with Springfield rifles. And I think that one of the officers involved might have even been our friend Sam Irwin, who will also show up later in the story.
Yes, Sam Irvin Jr., well, he's a very interesting character. He becomes known because of the Watergate hearings and becoming the U.S. Senator during Watergate. But I was fascinated how often his name came up. In terms of Morganton in the 1920s, Sam Irvin was up and coming character. And at the time of the Broadus Miller case, he was actually county attorney for Burke County. So he played a prominent role there. But you're right, even in 1925, Irvin was a member of the North Carolina National Guard unit in Morganton. And the National Guard unit in Morganton had actually been deployed to Asheville to provide security for the trials of Alvin Mansell and Preston Ely. One of the interesting things about the dynamic is that during the legal system at the time, The legal system and the state authorities in North Carolina were very concerned that there not be any definable lynchings in North Carolina. So there was this effort to, yes, that these trials must take place according to the letter of the law. And then if the person is actually innocent and found guilty, that's too bad, but the due process has been followed. Right? So the emphasis was that there would always be a trial, but you could not have extrajudicial lynchings. It was an assertion of the power and authority of the state, that the state had to be in control of this process. You couldn't just let private individuals form a mob and do it on their own. And so this whole dynamic was in play like during the middle 1920s. And one of the other things I find really fascinating about Alan Mansell is that during his trial, or immediately after his arrest, I should say, immediately after his arrest, the Ku Klux Klan in Asheville actually told the Buncombe County Sheriff about, hey, there's a mob forming on the streets. If you want to, we will help you defend the jailhouse and defend your prisoner. Because the Klan during this time period, I find that intersection with the Klan, with the story, a very interesting part of it. The Klan during this time period, at least in North Carolina, it was headed by a Superior Court judge,
Yeah.
Henry Alexander Grady. And Grady was a very much by the books, everything must be done legally, but white supremacy was essentially an integral part of the legal system, political system within North Carolina. So you could be racist and you could be white supremacist, but you could be very much be in favor of the law because the law itself had those elements in it.
Okay. Let's talk about the crime itself.
The murder of Gladys Kincaid.
Yes.
Yes. In between the time that Miller was in Asheville in 1925 and this murder in 1927 in Morganton, during that time period, Miller had actually gone back to Greenwood, South Carolina, because I found records of him in the courthouse there where he had been arrested for attempted burglary in South Carolina in Greenwood County. And he had served 9 months on a chain gang in Greenwood County in 1926. But he had come back to Asheville in the spring of 1927, where he found work as a manual laborer for a mason named Dante Martin, who was an Italian immigrant construction worker. And in the spring of 1927, Martin was hired to build a house in Morganton. A very elegant house. It's a mansion. It still stands today in Morganton, but it's the Frank Tate House in Morganton. It's a National Historic Site. A very elegant house. But Martin went from Asheville and brought with him this gang of construction workers, including Broadus Miller, to Morganton. And Broadus Miller had actually arrived in Morganton at almost the exact same time that 15-year-old Gladys Kincaid had started working in the textile mill in Morganton. So they were both essentially who had arrived in the town and had started working in the town at the same time. So it was, in some ways, it's a real tragic element of the story is how both of these people, they came from very tough, hard backgrounds, because Gladys Kincaid, she was someone who had grown up with a family that had suffered tragedies themselves. Her father had died a few years before, so her mother was widowed, and Gladys Kincaid herself had to quit school and begin working in a textile mill at age 15 in order to help support the family. And she had only been working in the textile mill for about a month or so when this occurred. But during her daily walks back and forth from home to the textile mill, she would travel through this black neighborhood in Washington where there was a boarding house where Broadus Miller had found a place to stay. And so he had actually been living on her route where she had walked every day. And afterwards, the other people who were staying in the boardhouse said, yeah, he had watched her when she walked by in the evenings. He had muttered something about, oh, she's too pretty to live, and that he had been agitated about her. And who knows what was going on in his mind, because if he was, and it seems like he was, mentally ill, then it's a question of what was he thinking and what was the rationale behind this.
Yeah. Now, shortly afterward, when she's found and she's unconscious and she dies at the hospital, I think 10 hours later, it becomes pretty readily apparent that the few clues that they do have point to Miller. And he
Yes.
goes on the run, and the best way I can phrase this is the entire community freaked, and about 1,000 people with guns start scouring the vicinity in a hunt for Miller.
Yeah, and I think freaked is an appropriate word. It was chaos in Morganton. When this news went out that evening, it went out over the wires. This pandemonium has erupted in Morganton. You had reporters from other parts of North Carolina, from Raleigh and Charlotte and all the big cities. They immediately head toward Morganton. And there was a journalist for the Raleigh News and Observer who had arrived in Morganton that night. And he said the entire town was up in arms, that there were people with guns, just hastily erected traffic stops on all of the roads. Anyone who refused to stop for a traffic stop, a car would be shot at. Um, and one of the things that I found really interesting is someone who had lived during the time period and had written a memoir later. He said, it is an absolute wonder that some innocent people weren't killed that night, because everybody was at peak rage and everybody was heavily armed. And there were situations where black men were seized, and one black man in the southern part of town was on the verge of being lynched until his white co-workers showed up on the scene, was walking by and said, hey, you have the wrong guy. This is definitely not Broadus Miller.
Now, I guess now would be a good time to talk about the outlawry statute in North Carolina.
Yes. And this was one of the aspects of the case that really intrigued me, because I was not very familiar at all with this until I started researching the case. But North Carolina, like usually, I guess, when we think of outlawry or we think of people being outlaws, we think of the Wild West, and we think about it in the western part of the country during the late 1800s. But North Carolina had an outlawry statute, and researching the outlawry statute, it surprised me because although outlawry, the process of outlawing someone, it has roots going back in English common law, well back into the Middle Ages. You can find evidence of outlawry in the Middle Ages, people who have been outlawed. And one of the things that I think is important to emphasize is that today, this even the word outlaw, it has a mystique. It's cool to be an outlaw. But the reality of being an outlaw was absolutely horrible. Insofar as the word itself, outlaw, it means you are outside of any legal protections. You are outside the law. You do not have any recourse to that protection of the law. Anyone is free to do what they want in terms of shooting you. Essentially, it deputizes the entire civilian population. Anyone has the right to say halt, and if the person doesn't halt, then blow them away. And looking at the history of the statute, what really intrigued me is that the statute that was used here, it was actually implemented in 1866, directly after the Civil War, and it was literally taken from the antebellum North Carolina slave code, the code that had previously been used against fugitive slaves. It had been adopted and slightly tweaked because now it was applicable to everybody, regardless of race. It wasn't just black African American slaves, but anybody could be designated an outlaw, which entailed either superior court judge or two local justices of the peace acting jointly, upon receiving an affidavit from a local sheriff saying this person is wanted for a felony but cannot be apprehended by the normal process of law. Once they receive that affidavit, they are required to issue an outlawry proclamation, which says that the person being sought is immediately ordered to turn themselves in to authorities. And if they do not do, then if they attempt to flee or if they resist arrest, anybody, any citizen of the state of North Carolina has a legal right to shoot and kill them.
Yeah, that was one of the
Um,
things that really surprised me. I always, I guess, somehow in the back of my head had this idea that it was like the governor or someone that declared someone an outlaw. But really, you just needed two magistrates or a judge.
yes. But it's not just you who thought that, even during the time period. What I find so striking is that even during the newspaper reports of this from the 1920s, you have journalists erroneously saying the governor has declared him an outlaw. But the actual proclamation of outlawry, it was printed in the Morganton newspaper, and you can see it was signed by two local justices of the police or justices of the peace. Those are the people who are responsible for enacting it and for putting it into motion.
Let's
And
talk.
one thing I mentioned, yeah,
Go
well, one
ahead.
thing I mentioned in my book, and I think it's undoubtedly true, is that when they were drafting this outlawry proclamation about Broadus Miller, the county attorney was Sam Irvin Jr. And I'm sure that Sam Irvin Jr. was the one who pulls the law book off the shelf and says, look, here is the passage, take it, the wording from here, because the outlawry statute, the way they used it, the way they enacted it, it was to the letter of the law. It was, they had done it, they had implemented the statute exactly as the law book said that it had to be implemented. And I'm sure that came with Sam Irvin's advice and consultation.
Yeah, the at this point, let's talk a little bit about the manhunt for Miller and the conditions that he lived through for the next 11 days. They were so nightmarish that it seems like that in and of itself almost would have been just so inhumane as to almost constitute punishment of a most bizarre and surreal kind.
Yes, no, I think first, like in terms of Miller's guilt, like when I first researched this case, when I first discovered it and first started researching it, I actually went into the research assuming that it was entirely possible that he was indeed innocent and that he had not done what he had been accused of, considering the time, the place, you
Yeah.
know, black man, white girl. But when I started researching it, especially when I discovered his history, the previous murder in South Carolina, a black woman, and then also when I first started researching this back in 2007, I actually interviewed people in Morganton who had been alive during the 1920s, including an African American woman who grew up in the neighborhood where Broadus Miller had lived, where he had stayed in Morganton. And I interviewed her. Her family had lived on the same street where all this took place, where Gladys Kincaid's body was found, where Broadus Miller had been residing. And I asked her straight out, do you think he did it? And she was like, yeah, I can see him having done it. And she was alive during the time period. She was intimately familiar with the circumstances. And taking into account everything, you're right, there was no trial. He was never formally convicted of this, but I think it is highly probable that he did indeed commit it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what he went through with the manhunt, in some ways, you just have to have an admiration for the physical feat that he accomplished. Insofar as for 11 days, he was literally being chased for his life. You had hundreds of armed people chasing him through the mountain woods in North Carolina for 11 days. And during this time period, I think at all times they were within a few hundred yards of him. Right?
Likely.
It was run for your life, literally. And he very quickly ran through his shoes. Like he wore out the leather on the bottom of his shoes because they were tracking him by bloody footprints that he was leaving because he no longer had any footwear. He had actually ran through his clothing. In terms of sleeping, it's crash wherever, whenever you can, possibly under a rhododendron bush or in the middle of a laurel thicket. In terms of eating, uh, if you can pilfer something out of a spring house or berries that are growing in the woods. But it was a phenomenal physical feat that he accomplished in terms of managing to stay alive for 11 days while being hotly pursued by hundreds of armed men. And when he was eventually shot, the newspaper account said that he had lost at least 25 pounds in 11 days. And I think it's likely that he even lost more weight than that. But within that short of a time period, a week and a half, lose at least 25 pounds, if not more. And it tells you about the speed at which he was being pursued.
Yeah, when they caught up with him, he was, for all intents and purposes, a broken man with no shoes, wearing rags. And that kind of brings us to the fatal encounter with Commodore Vanderbilt Burleson. And I have to say, the first time I read that man's name, I was very confused.
It is so odd, especially like his whole story is unusual. And Commodore Vanderbilt Burleson, he actually was born and grew up in the community of Linville Falls, North Carolina, which today is a nice little community where with some very elegant second homes that people have in the mountains. It's a very nice little town. But he had grown up there, and his father had been a very famous guide, mountain guide, and bear hunter.
Oh, yeah.
And Commodore Burleson himself, when he was growing up, he had a reputation for killing bears. There was a photographer named Frank Bickle, I think his name was. He has a collection of photographs in North Carolina State University archives, I think, or maybe the state archives. But
Yes.
he had lived in Linville Falls during the early 20th century, and he had compiled this photographic record of life in Linville Falls. And he has so many photographs showing men displaying the bears they have killed in the mountains. And most of these men, they're Commodore Burleson and his relatives. So Burleson was a very famous bear hunter who happened to marry a school teacher from Morganton who had been teaching at a mountain school in the mountains at Linville Falls. And he had moved back to her hometown in Morganton. And Burleson had taken a job with the town police for a while. And then he was working as a carpenter. So it was odd and end type work. In 1927, when this manhunt occurs for Broadus Miller, one of the things that really distinguishes the manhunt and really um, adds to the incentive that people had for being so eager to pursue Broadus Miller was the fact that you had enormous reward money being offered.
Oh, yeah.
That a total of over $1,500 is being offered for Broadus Miller, dead or alive. So it makes everyone take their guns and go out into the woods chasing Broadus Miller. If you can kill him, then you get $1,500, which in 1927 is an enormous sum of money. But Burleson had been on the track of Broadus Miller for days in the mountains unsuccessfully. He had gone back to Morganton, and there in Morganton, he had met and talked with some other people who had been involved with the manhunt. And they got the news that in Burnsville, North Carolina, a black man had been arrested and jailed as a suspect because essentially any lone black man who was traveling on his own in Western North Carolina during that time period was subject to arrest and being questioned. Who are you? Are you Broadus Miller? But they learned that this suspect had been arrested and jailed in Burnsville. So they started out on a Sunday morning driving toward Burnsville to check him out. And on the way to Burnsville, they stopped in the small town of Marion, and there they learned that the suspect in Burnsville had actually been transported to the Asheville County Jail for more security because the police in Burnsville were worried about a potential lynch mob coming for him. But they also learned that during the night before, there had been a burglary in a cafe in Linville Falls, Burleson's hometown, Burleson's home community. So they immediately turn and they head toward Linville Falls. And after pursuing Broadus Miller for days, being hot on his trail everywhere, Burleson eventually he takes a route that leads him back to his home, right, to his home community. This is where Broadus Miller has been spotted. And by the time they arrive on the scene, it's a few miles south of Linville Falls. And it's actually very close to Linville Caverns. Linville Caverns is a tourist destination. It's famous caverns. And it's probably about less than a mile south of Linville Caverns on a hilly mountainside. It's where Broadus Miller was eventually cornered. And the manhunters who were pursuing him, they went into the woods after him, and Commodore Burleson encountered him in the woods. And essentially, it was only Burleson and Miller there in the woods at that moment. These are thick mountain woods, and Broadus Miller ends up dead on the ground. Afterwards, the story is Broadus Miller was armed with a shotgun, which seems highly unlikely insofar as he was being chased hotly for 11 days, and there was no evidence of a gun on that trail during the whole time that he'd been chased. But the story went that Broadus Miller was armed and that there was an epic gunfight between Commodore Burleson and Broadus Miller, and Miller ended up dead. But then it would be disputed later whether Miller was actually armed or not. But after Miller was killed, then they dragged his body out of the woods, threw it in the back of their car, and drove back to Morganton with it.
One of the things that I found really fascinating when I was looking into the case is I found 3 or 4 different accounts from 3 or 4 different reporters. It looked like the reporters were thick as flies in Morganton during those 11 days. Each one had an account of the final battle between Burleson and Miller, and no two of them in any way even slightly match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, uh, it's, it's interesting. And some of the newspaper reports that I found, some of them were coming from a great distance away from the scene. There's a newspaper account from a Chicago newspaper, which is actually an African American owned newspaper, the Chicago Defender, that put out an account afterwards that had that it bore no semblance to anything that could have possibly happened. But essentially, the more people are removed from the scene, then the less reliable the
Oh yeah.
newspaper reports are going to be.
Yeah, I guess we need to talk for a moment anyway about what they did with Miller's body when they got back to Morganton.
Yeah. So they arrived in Morganton around noon on Sunday, and when actually had the opportunity when I first started researching this to interview Commodore Burleson's children. Um,
Wow.
they were still alive, and they had at least his oldest daughter. She was a young girl at this time, but she could still remember it. She said that she and her brother they had just gotten out of Sunday school. They'd gotten out of Sunday school and they were walking home, and they saw this car pull into town, screech into town, speeding into the middle of town, with the men in the car sticking their heads out the windows, shouting to the crowd, "Got him! Here he is!" But also using racial epithets about we have the N word here. And she said that she and her brother they had witnessed this car come into town, pull screeching up to the courthouse. The men in the car get out. They grab Broadus Miller's body and they pull it out of the car by its feet. Another witness account of it says that said that you could actually hear the head hitting the cobblestones, like when they're pulling it out of the car. And they lay it there on the ground for a few minutes, and people are swarming. Then they grab it and they drag the body into the Burke County courthouse and pull it into a room in the bottom of the county courthouse, where it stays probably for half an hour or maybe a little more. But during that time period, you had so many people swarming. People were getting out of church in downtown Morganton. So you have all these people who are wearing their Sunday finest, the women in dresses and the men in suits. They're all getting out of church on a Sunday afternoon, and they go swarming to this courthouse where you have this dead body on public display. And like the imagery or even the twisted symbolism of Christians seeing executed dead body on a Sunday and rejoicing over it is just really bizarre. But
Yeah,
it was there
yeah,
there in the bottom of the courthouse for a while, and then they dragged it outside, and they actually put it, which is um, even more contentious. They actually displayed it at the base of a Confederate monument on the courthouse lawn, which
yeah,
afterwards, especially in today, it has created a real sense, intense debate about the Morganton courthouse and the Confederate monument at the Morganton courthouse, considering that the Confederate monument was used as the backdrop for the public display of a dead black man.
yeah. You cannot get past that symbolism. So let's talk a little bit about some people that really, some people that really shape and this whole incident. Beatrice Cobb, Sam Irwin Jr., and unfortunately the Klan.
Yes, Beatrice Cobb, you had mentioned earlier how unusual it was for there to be someone like Dr. Ann Young in South Carolina during the 1920s. And Beatrice Cobb is the same in terms of someone who is a woman who is remarkably influential considering the day and time. For the 1920s, Beatrice Cobb is a remarkable figure. She was the editor of the Morganton News Herald, the newspaper of Morganton. She had inherited the paper from her father after he passed away, but she had taken it over and made it her own. She was a one woman dynamo who is constantly reporting, publishing, doing it as a business. And she's also very active politically. She serves in the Democratic Party in Burke County. She attends national conventions of the Democratic Party. Um, and so she's a remarkable figure. And during this time period of the Broadus Miller case, um, her coverage of the case, it was very sensationalistic. It was very lurid, her descriptions. And she obviously, like her portrayal of Broadus Miller and her portrayal of black criminality in general, is very problematic. Yet at the same time, what I find when I research Beatrice Cobb is that she's also a very firm supporter of Morganton's native black community, like the African American community in Morganton. Beatrice Cobb was a figure who would actually contribute money and a type of almost paternalistic protection for the local black community, saying, "Look, these are our neighbors. They're not responsible for the crime. It's Broadus Miller. He is the bad guy. He is a villain." And she would use despicable language about him, but she would also say, "Don't blame the local black community for what Broadus Miller has done." So it's that this it's a people are complicated, and that is one of the things that I really that I really realized when researching this is that people are very complicated individuals, and there's good and bad mixed together in every individual. I would say even Broadus Miller, right?
Yeah,
Like if you look at his circumstances, the way he grew up, people are very complicated.
Indeed.
But yeah, Beatrice Cobb is a remarkable figure, and like even today, even people who are not familiar with who Beatrice Cobb is, they will recognize the name because Highway 181 that goes from Hickory and Morganton and goes up to Boone, North Carolina. It is officially labeled the Beatrice Cobb Highway. And so you have Beatrice Cobb Highway signs next to Highway 181 because she had advocated for it and she had urged its creation, the highway's creation, for years. So she was a really remarkable figure.
Now, Sam Irvin Jr. He is all over this case. Tell us a little bit about his role.
Yes, Irvin, he's very prominent, obviously, like in the Morganton social scene, Morganton politics. As you had mentioned earlier, he had been deployed with the rest of the Morganton National Guard to Asheville during the Alvin Mansell and Preston Neely cases. And during the Broadus Miller case, as I said earlier, Irvin was the county attorney for Burke County. So Irvin was at the heart of the legal battle about what to do in the case of Broadus Miller. And Irvin, he was already politically very well connected because when the governor of North Carolina sent personal envoy to Morganton to discuss the case with local officials, it was a man named Edwin Bridges, who was an attorney from Charlotte. But he turned out he and Sam Irvin Jr. had gone to school together at Chapel Hill. Were old schoolmates. Irvin and Bridges knew each other really well. Bridges had been to Irvin's wedding. He had been sent there the very weekend that Broadus Miller was cornered and shot and killed in the woods. And when news of this, news that Miller had been seen near Linville Falls, when it had come to Morganton, then the county sheriff, Bridges, and Sam Irvin Jr., all the three of them hopped in an automobile and sped toward the scene. They actually passed, without apparently knowing it, they actually passed the manhunters who at this time had killed Miller and had his body in the back of their car. They passed him going in the opposite direction. So they arrive in Linville Falls, realize that, oh, they're make a U-turn, drive back to Morganton. And that afternoon, Vanderbilt Burleson actually goes into Sam Irving Jr.'s law office and sits there and gives evidence. He gives his testimony as to what occurred in Irvin's office to the governor's envoy, Edwin Bridges. And when Commodore Burleson is describing the process by which Miller was shot, Sam Irvin Jr. speaks up and says, "Yeah, I've had eyewitnesses told me the bullets actually hit the tree you were hiding behind." And Burleson was like, "Oh, really?" Yeah. So apparently, he was very concerned to make sure that this looked very above board in terms of the way that Broadus Miller had been killed. And then later, 3 weeks later, when other witnesses came forward and said there was no sign of Broadus Miller ever having a gun on this trail, Sam Irvin Jr. was actually hired by Commodore Burleson to defend him in bringing lawsuit for slander against these people who had defamed Burleson by saying that Miller had no gun, which was eventually settled for one symbolic cent in damages and an apology. Irvin was a very interesting character in this whole process. And one of the things that I find interesting and just head scratching is that years later, uh, half a century later, Irvin, in a book of local history, he's putting together a testimonial for a former sheriff of Burke County. And he just alludes to the Broadus Miller case. He was like, he was a great sheriff during this time period. And he just alludes to it. And he says the brand hunt for Broadus Miller took 3 days. And I'm like, that doesn't, I don't even understand how you would think that anyone who is familiar with the case would even buy that, right? Because it obviously took place over a period of 11 days in the mountains. And uh, Irving categorically states it was a 3-day manhunt.
Wow.
It's puzzling.
So, how does the Klan figure in this story?
One of the surprising ways in which it figures into the story is that Commodore Vanderbilt Burleson himself was the head of the Morganton chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. So the man who had been hunting Broadus Miller, it obviously has that Klan component to it. And the day after Broadus Miller was killed, to backtrack for just a moment, the night before, after this, you had this public exhibition in Morganton. Miller's body was transported out of town that evening because local officials were afraid that if they kept it in town, there would be people who would try to take the body and desecrate it. And so they wanted to ship it out of town. And so the body was shipped to Statesville, North Carolina, where the following morning it was buried in an anonymous grave on the outskirts of an African American cemetery in Statesville. Co- Coincidentally, presumably it's coincidental, that same day the Ku Klux Klan was having their prearranged annual state gathering for North Carolina in Statesville.
Yeah.
The annual rally of the North Carolina Ku Klux Klan was taking place in the same city where Broadus Miller was being buried. And guest of honor was at the annual gathering of the Klan was Commodore Vanderbilt Burleson, the killer of Broadus Miller. So the Klan celebrated Miller's death, and that night there was a large procession of Klansmen and through the streets of Statesville, and then a celebration of the 4th of July. Because this was the 4th of July when
Yeah.
this takes place.
Yeah, they caught up with Miller on the 3rd, and they had the big Klan rally in Statesville on the 4th.
Yeah.
So,
If you wrote this as a novel, people would say that it was unbelievable, like the timing, right? It's incredible.
agreed. So, was the death of Miller a legal lynching?
It's a very murky area because it also calls into question what is justice, what is in terms of legality. In Broadus Miller's killing, because of the outlawry statute, Broadus Miller's killing was legal. Right? And in question in terms of legal lynching, it certainly didn't take place through the regular judicial process, but it was nonetheless judicially sanctioned. Right? So it's a question, if there is this category of legal lynching, then how far do you expand it? Because in 1920s North Carolina, there were also people who were arrested, tried, convicted, and executed within a period of weeks or months. Right? A very rushed process. Is that acceptable to have this collapsed into such a short period? Or is that also a form of quote unquote lynching? Which that's where the definition becomes so problematic and it becomes such a gray area. But for people in 1920s North Carolina, the actual dynamic that was going on in 1920s North Carolina is that you had public officials celebrating the way that Broadus Miller had been killed because we avoided a lynching. Because by
Yes.
their conception, by their imagining of what it means to be a lynching, it would it would have had to have been by definition against the law, something that was in opposition to the authority of the state, in opposition to state officers. But in this case, it's the very murky middle ground, and I don't know whether it's a satisfying answer, but
Yeah.
it, but
It,
how do you label something like this?
yeah. It is a very gray area. Okay. Let's talk about the ballads of Gladys Kincaid.
Yes. especially like during this time period, early 20th century, you have this long ballad tradition that is continuing. It's a way of events being commemorated and being memorialized. And her death, what happened with her death and the hunt for Broadus Miller, it inspired a series, um, a broadside ballad, which was composed, and I don't think it was intended to be sung, but it was more a poetic composition, and at least three folk ballads that were comprised about the case. And these folk ballads that were sung, a couple of them were collected during the 1930s. One was collected by Mellinger Henry, the famous folk song collector, and the other by Frank C. Brown, who is also a famous folklorist and folk song collector. And then there is a third ballad that was composed during a few months later in 1927, and it was composed by a couple of Burke County musicians who actually went to Atlanta and recorded it, but the recording was never released because the Kincaid family, Gladys Kincaid's family, didn't want it to be released. They thought it was too painful. They thought it was, I think also, they thought it was too inflammatory. Because one thing that I really admire about Gladys Kincaid's family is that her siblings and the Kincaid family, they've always been adamant that Broadus Miller, the what perpetrator, but do not make it an entirely racial thing where you stigmatize an entire population. But that is something that really occurs in the broadside poem and in all three of the ballads that were composed about the case. I have never heard any of the ballads being sung. Two of the three ballads I have copies of the lyrics to, but I've never heard any of the ballads being sung because they're very racially explicit. The language they use is very racially explicit. And they very much condemn this in racial terms and see it all through this lens of innocent white girl, evil black man, and it becomes. Think I don't think that today I can't imagine that they would ever be performed.
Yeah, I could only find the lyrics to one. I believe it's the murder of Gladys Kincaid. I'm aware of another one called The Dreadful Fate of Gladys Kincaid, but somewhere I may have encountered the broadside at some point, but I don't currently have it anywhere in my notes or folders.
Yeah, the murder of Gladys Kincaid is actually the title of the broadside as well. So
Okay.
that may be the broadside. It was
Okay.
composed by two people locally. Yeah. And the dreadful fate of Gladys Kincaid, I think the lyrics have never been written down on that I know of. Apparently, one of the musicians' son was continuing to perform that ballad in little joints in Louisiana, little places in the backwoods of Louisiana, late into the 20th century. But it's you can only imagine what kind of venues or what kind of audiences would be listening to this.
Yeah, yeah. That gets problematic fast. So, if you were going to compare these ballads to something like Knoxville Girl or Omi Wise, what would you say?
I think that one of the things that I would say about it is it seems like Soul Girl and Omi Wise, they also fit into that tradition of Tom Dooley.
Yeah.
The idea that what is happening in these cases is a case where uh, a former lover is being killed or someone who had a romantic relationship with the woman is killing and in some ways is tortured by regret. But in this case, like what happened with Gladys Kincaid, I think there is no sign or no evidence that there was ever any connection of Broadus Miller and Gladys Kincaid before the actual killing of Gladys Kincaid.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to remember because it also comes up like when I casually have spoken with the case about people before, even in Morganton, there's this almost an innuendo that, oh, maybe there was something happening between the two of them. There was not. And so there's that fundamental distinction on one hand. I think on the other, also what's interesting is I think the ballads you mentioned, Knoxville Girl, Oh Me Wise, they're also, I would say, they're not villainizing the 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 murderer, right? They're like there's almost like an empathy for the person who has committed the deed. Or that in Tom Dooley, right? Like
Oh
hang
yeah.
down your head, Tom Dooley. It's almost there's more. There's I wouldn't say more, but there's equal sympathy for the killer. Tragic story on both ends. And with these ballads about Gladys Kincaid, there's no element of that. They are very figuratively and literally black and white. They are very clear cut. Um, Broadus Miller is a complete evil, monstrous
Yes.
figure, and Gladys Kincaid is the epitome of virtue and a saint. And so there's that distinction, I would say, between those types of ballads and the ballads that were composed in this case.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of this story. I want to ask you how Broadus Miller is remembered or forgotten in Morganton and Western North Carolina, but let me preference that by saying that both you and I are from Western North Carolina, and neither one of us knew the story until adulthood when we started basically researching and writing about the topic.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that I have met people in Morganton who have their families had moved into Morganton in the mid 20th century, like 1950s or beyond, who had never heard of it. But the people whose families have lived in Morganton since the 1920s or who were there present during the 1920s, they had definitely heard of it. This was a story that was whispered about around kitchen tables and people's homes, but it was not publicized to a larger world. And it's interesting, I think, in large part, what happened is in the aftermath of this case, everyone was just like, oh God, let's not publicly talk about it because all it does is it just creates problems talking about it because of the racial aspect of it. And I would argue that is precisely the problem in terms of not talking about it is that you just it festers underneath the surface. And you also get these wild exaggerations about what had happened in Morganton. There are people who told me, oh, Broadus Miller's body was dragged behind a car through the streets of Morganton. And like, judging from all the evidence from the 1920s, that did not occur. But you still have people who say things like this because it was never discussed publicly and it was never gone at objectively, like what was happening. And one of the reasons also that contributed to this is in the immediate aftermath of what had happened, immediate aftermath of the exhibition of Broadus Miller's body in Morganton, the state press in North Carolina had a filled day with this. Newspapers in Raleigh and in the eastern part of the state, like, tisk, 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 you primitive people in Morganton, you. And I think actually people, the white population of Morganton, they were much more offended by being called hillbillies than being called racist. It's like they think we're primitive hillbillies, right? And so that we created enormous resentment against these outsiders talking about the case. And Broadus Miller, or I should say Beatrice Cobb herself, had actually stated in the Morganton News Herald a week after the case, she was like, we will have no further public discussion of this case because she was so highly offended by the way that Raleigh News and Observer and other major papers in North Carolina had completely lambasted Morganton as being this primitive community where the people are completely uncivilized.
Okay. Now, in
And
your
but
research,
it I would just say also it festers underneath the surface. There was an ethnologist named Claudia Gould who was living in Morganton in the 1970s, and she said that she often, when talking with people, they would whisper about the Broadus Miller story, and they assumed this significance that honestly, um, what Claudia Golden said is that white families in Morganton used it as a warning to their daughters, stay away from black men. And what surprised me, and it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did because I hadn't even considered it at the time, is a few months ago I had actually had a discussion in Morganton, a facilitated discussion with people. And black resident of Morgan had told me those same conversations were taking place in black households where sons were being told, stay away from white women because if you try to get involved with one, look what happened to Broadus Miller.
Yeah.
And so it became this wedge issue that just completely festered underneath the surface and is incredibly racially divisive.
Now, in your research, court records, newspaper archives, oral histories, talking to relatives of the people involved, what were some of the more surprising things that you came across?
Yeah, I would think first and foremost, the biggest surprise was the revelation about Broadus Miller's mental condition
Right.
from the court records in Anderson. Because until I discovered that, I had no inkling, and I had not even considered the possibility of this being a factor in the case. And finding that essentially just one page with like a couple of sentences on it, and finding that literally stunned me. I can remember my reaction when I read it, and I was like, "Oh my god!" Because it just opened up a new window that I hadn't even thought about before. What else surprised me is when I first discovered that Broadus Miller had been convicted and sentenced in South Carolina for killing a middle-aged black woman previously, and I discovered that, and like, and it was months into the process after I had come to my thinking about the case, and it just put everything in a different light when I found that as well.
Yeah,
Um,
S.C.
and
Walker.
yeah, and I would say the third like real surprise is when I was talking with Commodore Burleson's son, and I was interviewing him, and he was talking about his father, and he was talking about what his father did in the 1920s. And then he just happened to mention back when dad was in the Klan, he used to, what? Because that was never publicized in the newspaper accounts of 1927. Commodore Burleson is actually in the Morganton Klan. And that surprised me, which again, it probably should not, but it came unexpectedly.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I've written about a lot of historical true crimes, mostly in Appalachia, but this particular case, it seems like it cast quite a longer shadow than most of the stuff that I've written about. What do you have to say about the legacy of this case?
Yeah, it is. I think it is a case that in many ways exemplifies larger trends and larger patterns. And I find it remarkable how one person's life, like Broadus Miller, can exemplify these like much larger patterns of human movement and behavior. That if you trace his life story, it goes through different places at specific times when things were happening in those places, and you see his story is essentially a reflection of these larger patterns. What was happening in Asheville when he arrived there, his departure from South Carolina because of the boll weevil, and the circumstances under which it took place, the time he spent in the South Carolina State Penitentiary, which happened to coincide with a time period when the state legislature in South Carolina had launched an investigation of the state penitentiary and had taken eyewitness testimony about the conditions in the state penitentiary. And if you see all of the formative influences that went into making Broadus Miller the figure that he was or the figure that he became, I, I'm not saying that it excuses his behavior, but it certainly makes his behavior more understandable.
Yeah,
And
he's
larger issues, go ahead.
go. Oh, he, in a lot of ways, it seems like he's caught up in the flow, in the tide of the times. It really seems to move him through the story almost against his will.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say that about almost against his will, um, because I was tempted at one time. I was thinking of different epigraphs for the story, and nice quotation to put at the beginning of the story, and I was actually considering using one from the philosopher Schopenhauer, who had written a sentence about if you look at a person's childhood, they can seem like innocent victims who little know what is waiting for them in the future. That they're going to be dragged along by circumstances into situations that they could never imagine. But another epigraph that occurred to me and came like in retrospect because when I was younger, I had read a novel by Thornton Wilder called The Bridge of San Luis Rey, which is an account of how Franciscan friar in Peru in the 1700s, he is traveling, and just ahead of him on the road, there's this rope bridge across a chasm. And he sees that there are travelers on this rope bridge, and just ahead of him, a few hundred feet ahead of him, the bridge collapses, and all the people on that bridge die. And it stuns him, of course, because he's just a few seconds away. It could have potentially happened from him to him. But it stuns him so much that he devotes the rest of his life to researching why did this event occur at this time, and why were these specific people, why were they the victims of this event? And so he traces all of their life histories. How did they end up at this point in this time? And that really influenced me because the whole format of what I was doing in the research, I think I was driven by that underlying question of why Broadus Miller and Gladys Kincaid and why those two people intersected at this particular time in this particular place. And it does seem like there's a hidden underlying what will within the world. And in some ways, we're acting out like puppets on a stage, not even aware of the larger forces that are controlling our lives.
I understand. So, in closing, where can listeners find your work and what are you working on these days?
Yeah, in terms of my work, The Violent World of Broadus Miller, it's published by the University of North Carolina Press, and it's available through independent bookstores and also on the larger markets such as Amazon and the online retailers. Um, my other work, I've done some work on slavery in Western North Carolina, and I've published articles on that through the University of Georgia Press. And right now, in some ways, writing The Violent World of Broadus Miller consumed my life for so long, researching it and trying to put this story together, that I felt compelled to write it.
All right, that seems like a good place to leave it. That's it for this episode of the Blue Ridge True Crime Podcast. If you've enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing. Check the show notes for links to the Blue Ridge True Crime Substack and YouTube channel, and any story-related links. Until next time, I'll look for you on the back roads.